Welcome to the TC Dojo from Single Sourcing Solutions. TC Dojo is a TechCom community that is driven by you. Tell us what you want to learn, you choose the topics, and we find the experts. In the TC Dojo open session today, we are lucky to have Tony Mantich with us as our visiting dojo master. Tony is an information architect at ADP. In this role, she directs information architecture, content strategy for a department of over 60 information developers and provides training and planning and strategy related to tools, technology, process. If you might not know Tony, but she's also a teacher of over 30 university courses in literature, writing, technical communication for both undergraduates and graduates. She's a certified project management professional and an AIM certified taxonomy and metadata practitioner. And we are beyond thrilled that she is visiting our dojo as our dojo master today. Tony wants you to save your questions until the end, so be sure to type them in when you think of them so you don't forget what you wanted to ask. Tony, I'm going to switch presentation to you. Show your screen and it's all yours. Tony?
Okay, are you seeing my screen?
Absolutely.
And are you seeing it in presentation mode? There we go.
Perfect.
All right, well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon or morning or lunchtime if you're on the East Coast, or evening perhaps. I'm coming to you from Portland, Oregon, and I'm glad to have the chance to talk with you a bit about metadata. Before we get started, I do work for ADP, but nothing I say here can be attributed or blamed on them. The obligatory disclaimer. This is what I'm going to try to do in our short session today is talk a little bit about the ascendance of metadata, why it has become so prevalent in conversations and conferences and literature. I'm going to give a few definitions and examples. I'm not going to go overboard with that. We don't have a lot of time, and there's a whole lot to say about metadata, but I do want to give some examples and talk about some of what metadata enables. And then I want to talk specifically about why it's relevant to those of us who work in technical communications and how it might change some roles that we might see in our departments, and even some work that we would do in roles such as content development and authoring. And then I hope to leave some time for questions. So, metadata's ascendance, or going on the metaphor of the title, it's ascension. In the last many years, you've probably heard a whole lot about metadata, and that's because of the Internet of Things, the networking of knowledge, the way we use computers to do everything. Right? We live in a digitally mediated existence now, and metadata is really important to how that all works. So this has happened rather quickly, as I see it. Not so long ago, years ago. This is the corner of a deck, a slide at the beginning of a deck that I gave at a couple of conferences, and I started by asking if people knew what metadata was, and getting a fair number of people who didn't. This was from 2014 at a couple of conferences, and at that time, metadata was beginning to make the news in not such good ways, right? This is when the whole NSA, they're only collecting metadata thing came out. But there were other ways we were hearing about metadata as well, and in terms of how companies were using it to learn about clients and customers. You'll notice in these, if you have time to read them and look at them closely, though, the metadata still, as of 2 years ago, was still being still had quotation marks around it, or was being used without the word being used, right? So there wasn't this assumption, as I think there is now, that people know what metadata means, at least at some general level. Today, metadata is everywhere. These are headlines just from the last week or two. This one from June 27th, the power of metadata, how metadata features in the entertainment industry. That's in the Denver Post, right? That's not a technical paper. The role of metadata in security, how metadata can help in performance and organizational improvement, BPI, that kind of thing. Music metadata, important, very important.
Uh-oh, Tony? Tony?
Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
Sorry, we thought you got dropped out. There you go.
All right. You can hear me now? So now we're still seeing metadata more and more in the news, but it's often discussed without it being defined, right? There's this assumption that people at least have some sense of what it means. And I think that's because a lot of people now apply metadata, right? We live in a social world where we tag things, and so we have a general sense of what metadata is. So I want to drill down into that a little bit. My title, I thought, was really clever when I gave it to Liz, and then I discovered some problems with it the more I thought about it. But the idea is, you know, several years ago there was, well, and there still is, I think, a lot of conversation about content being king, right? And a lot of this comes from media companies and internet companies who see content as an asset, right, because they can sell it and sell access to it, right? So there's a lot of literature and debate about content being king. But I was thinking, well, if content is king, then metadata has to at least be a queen, right? And then the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was problematic. First of all, because of the, you know, if you're a poker player, at least king and queen are not equal, right? King outranks queen. And then there's all sorts of weird gender implications I didn't want to get into. So if we're going to say that metadata is queen, it at least has to be in the William and Mary variety, where they were actually co-regents, co-rulers, not a king with a queen consort kind of thing. So when I say this, I don't mean to kind of, I actually meant to elevate metadata, and metadata really actually unlocks the power of content. So I don't think it should be seen as kind of a queen consort, as it were, but actually a queen, a co-reigning with content, an enabler, as it were, of content. And just to back that up, here's some, you know, some quotes just from recent conferences and reading I've been doing to really drive that point home. David Weinberger, who's written a bunch of really great books about knowledge in the internet age, said a couple months ago at a conference where he was keynoting that metadata is not really all that different from data anymore. He said metadata is what you know. So you might know that you're looking for a thing that's in this category, for example, and then the data or the content is what you're looking for, and you're using that metadata to help you find the data that you're looking for. Jeffrey Pomerantz, who just last year released a book from MIT that is a really good introduction to metadata, says in the modern era of ubiquitous computing, metadata has become infrastructural, and he compares it to the electric grid or the highway system. And he talks about how even though we don't think about that, you know, the electric grid, we just flip the switch, and we don't think about the highway system too much when we're driving on it, but they're absolutely essential for us to do what we want to do, and metadata, he says, it is like that. And then Amber Swope, who some of you may have known, she is a longtime data advocate and now has with IBM and now has her own data consultancy, said a couple years ago, metadata makes the world go round. You might not know it, but it does. So if we take that all to and agree to stipulate that the metadata is really important, I want to break down a little bit now what we really mean by metadata. The traditional definition, of course, is data about data, which is not all that helpful. I do want to say that when we talk about metadata, we're not really talking about data per se. We're talking about data about content, right? Because that's what we do, content development. So what does this really mean, and how does it really work? The way I used to teach it is I used to say metadata makes computers smart. And here's just a really simple illustration, vastly simplified, but here are 3 pieces of content. They're all related to my recent visit to Ireland. Cobblestone, which is a pub, had the best traditional music. It's located at the Cobblestone pub. It's located in Smithfield near the Jameson Distillery, and I gave it 4 stars out of 5. These are 3 pieces of content. The computer looks at this and sees this, right? Those are just, you know, kind of black boxes of content. Sure, it can do like a natural language search, right? It can search for strings, but it doesn't understand, right? Most computers that aren't named Watson can't read and they can't think, right? So what metadata does, it provides handles or labels for computers and machinery to deal with the black boxes of content or data, but we're more concerned about content here. So for example, I could have a metadata label that says that first line where I said, you know, that Cobblestone had the best traditional music is a review comment. And the second line where I said where it was is a location, right? And the third, the stars were a rating, right? So it's saying what that kind of content, it's describing the content in some ways. And there are lots of different types of metadata, but they're all kind of doing that, right? They're providing some sort of information about the data or content. And this is important because, again, most computers that aren't named Watson can't think. And so what we then have to do is we write business rules or logical rules that the computer can then just use in combination with these labels to do stuff. So we can say, print out a document and put the location first and then the rating and then the review. And so it combines those business rules with the metadata and can do that processing even though it doesn't actually understand that sentence, Cobblestone had the best traditional music. It doesn't really understand that that's a review, but it knows it because we've labeled it. So that's just a really simple example. But that, for me, that's one of the easiest ways to understand what metadata is doing. It's making the black boxes of content or data something that a computer can work with using business rules. Sometimes the metadata that we apply to content will be visible and understandable and usable for human beings, but an awful lot of the time it isn't. A lot of the time it's being consumed and used by the computer to do, or the system, whatever the system is, to do operations on the content to make the content more friendly to the end user, right? So even if the end user doesn't see the metadata, it's hard at work underneath, kind of like that electric grid or that highway, to make all of the actions we do with our digital systems work to create and store and retrieve content. So here are some examples of metadata. Hopefully some of these will be familiar to you. This, anybody know? This is from iTunes, right? This is, if we think about iTunes, the content are the individual song tracks. Sorry, my cat is on the other side of a door in another room, and I can still hear him through the door. I hope he's not too distracting for you all. So all of these fields, the content in iTunes is a song track. All of these fields are basically metadata, right? And I'm only showing one tab, right? There's also artwork, lyrics, options, etc. And some of these, like lyrics, for example, can be both metadata and content in a sense, right? The lyrics, the printout of the lyrics are metadata about the recording, the recorded song, but they also then are content in themselves as well. So this is all example of metadata here. Here's an example of a tweet, and look, there's Liz. A tweet I sent out during STC when Liz was talking, and there's various types of content and metadata here, right? The picture is obviously content. My comment explaining what Liz is doing is also content, but it has metadata embedded in it because this hashtag at STC16 and the @ before single sourcing and scriptorium tell Twitter that those are particular kinds of information, right? The STC is a keyword, and the and single sourcing and scriptorium refer to account holders. And then there's other metadata here as well, right? It shows Liz and Sarah O'Keefe and scriptorium as people. At the bottom, it shows that it's been retweeted once. That's what we call use metadata. It shows that a couple people have liked it at this point. So there's a lot of metadata going on that is actually visible to the user in this case. Here's another example from social media. This one is from Facebook. This is from my trip to Ireland as well. The content here is the picture of the bridge. Metadata includes my name and my picture, which indicate that I'm the person who posted this, the date I posted it, the fact that it's been edited, the privacy status of it, my little description, my caption is a form of metadata, the location, Dublin, Ireland, the fact that 3 people have liked or hearted it. So a lot of metadata there. It's just a very small thing. And again, that's metadata that is visible to the end user. And then let me just show you a couple examples of metadata that are a little closer to what we do during our work days, hopefully more often than we do Facebook and Twitter. This is the properties window from Adobe Acrobat in the last session. Alan mentioned looking at this sometimes to see what tool had created PDFs. And you'll see that there are a bunch of tabs here, and most of these tabs contain metadata. You'll notice that many of these fields here are editable, and I haven't put in any metadata, but then there are a bunch of fields that are automatically filled in by the system, when it was created, when it was modified, what tool created it, where it's located. That's all metadata. The content was a simple PDF file up here called Case Lang Veers. These were tickets to a concert I had recently. But all the rest of this is metadata. The content is the PDF file. Here's another example that's similar. This is from a recent version of Word, right? This is if you look at the properties on a document. Again, a lot of this is exactly by the system. I could go in and add a title and some tags and comments and some user-generated metadata as well. But that's just another example of metadata. And this last one is an example. If any of you work in Oxygen or actually any editor or authoring tool that supports conditional publishing, you probably have something like this where you can select some text and then assign metadata to it that tells you the conditions or the particular audience or context that content applies to. So in this case, I can say, you know, this piece of content is for novice users and it's for Mac users and Windows users, but not Linux or Solaris. So this one gives me little check boxes and allows me to apply that metadata to whatever content I have selected at kind of a sub-document level. So these are some examples of metadata that we as authors might come across. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why this is so important and new ways that we're using this more and more. But before I do that, just a few other common names of things that are actually metadata that you might hear. Tags, obviously. Attributes, if you work in XML, for example, you'll hear about attributes a lot. Attributes are metadata by another name. Properties, like document properties. Conditions, if you do conditional publishing, your conditions are metadata. Some tools call metadata labels. And this is only a partial list, but to give you a sense of some of the metadata you might already be working with. So I already pointed this out a little bit, but metadata is created a lot of different ways. Some of it is created automatically by systems. Some of it is created by users according to a schema or a taxonomy or some structured architecture that's already set up. In other words, you can only put in certain values, right, according to this taxonomy. And then there's another form of metadata where users can create metadata that doesn't match any particular architecture. And you know, the best example of this, right, is Twitter, right, where you just make up hashtags and those become metadata. So there's different ways of creating metadata that have different advantages and disadvantages, which of course we can't go through all those today, but I think it's important to realize that. And then I wanted to give you a partial list of some categories of metadata as well. There's three really common ones that you hear about, and then there's a couple others. I'm only going to go through the three kind of top contenders here in a simplified way. One is descriptive metadata, and this is a lot of what we really think of as metadata. The things that people add as tags, these are things that really describe the content and what it does or what it means. And the main purpose of this kind of metadata is to help users find things. Some examples from TechCom of this would be those profiling conditions, right? When you say this content is relevant only for this product or this audience or this release, it's describing that content, right? You could also say this content is this particular procedure is a really hard procedure, right? It's for an expert user, or it might take extra time, right? There's all kinds of different descriptions you could make. Those are just a couple that come to mind out of the TechCom world. There's administrative data. A lot of administrative metadata is automatically created by the system, so things like created by the author. But there's other kinds as well. You can assign, for example, who a reviewer might need to be for a particular piece of content. That would be administrative. Administrative metadata is designed mostly to help you manage the content. So maybe help push it through an editorial workflow, for example. So some examples of metadata in this category that we might use are those things like Where did this content come from? Did it originally come from an SME? Did it originally come from a tech writer? Who's the owner? Who's the assigned reviewer? What's the status of it? Is it in draft? Has it been approved? Has it been published? That's administrative metadata. And the list could go on and on here. And then there's structural metadata. And this is metadata that defines how the content is going to be structured, how it relates to other pieces of content, how it might be assembled or presented. The best example, the example I usually fall back on here, are semantic element tags. So, for example, if you work in DITA, all of those content elements are defined by tags, and those are really meta tags, right? It says this is a title. The content in between these tags is a step. And there are similar constructions in other tools as well, especially if they're structured authoring tools. But it's important to realize that the metadata is not just that kind of descriptive metadata that we're really used to, but even your basic architecture is, in a sense, metadata. So that's a really quick survey of some key defining characteristics or way of thinking about different categories of metadata. So then the question is, what's this good for? And the thing that most often comes to mind is helping people find things. And that, again, is why it's had this huge rise to popularity, because we've been inundated with information, right? And so we need tools to help us filter that down and find things, because we're just awash in a sea of content and data. And that's why metadata is so much more important. But and there are some people who define metadata exclusively as helping content, data about content that helps you find information. But metadata can do other things as well. It can help with process improvements. It can help you do user research, and it can do a whole bunch of other things. Some of those headlines at the beginning suggested some of the other possible things it can do. But let's take a look at a few that will be more germane to what we do. The most important one, again, is findability and retrievability. And this is whether a machine or a human being is looking for it. Although even when a human being is looking for it, right, it's usually the machine that's mediating that process. So again, metadata primarily at its root is about helping machines manage content, even if it's doing it in the service, we hope, of human beings. So some of the ways you can use this metadata is you can use the categories and the values that you set up in your metadata scheme to provide navigational links in your UI. So for example, if you're on a shopping site and they might have a list of headings across the top that are categories, say men, women, and children, for example, those are really metadata categories. And if you click that, you're not pulling up a pre-formatted page where somebody has laid out everything. Instead, it's dynamically pulling that content based on a metadata value of, clothing for men. So it can help with your visual order and your UI navigation. It can help filter your search results to make them much more effective. So if Liz is on an ADP help site and logs in and searches on time card, it will know from her user credentials that she's a manager, and it will show her topics about filling out her own time card, but also about approving her subordinates' time cards. But if I log in and I'm not a manager, it's not going to show those topics about approving time cards. So it can be used to make search results more tailored and more filtered and more personal. And related to this, it powers what we call intelligent content and dynamic publishing. And that's similar to what I just described, but it allows us to also push content. It's not just about search results. It's about when somebody visits a site, automatically knowing what content to put on that site based on things we know about that user. David Weinberger talks about, had a couple really great quotes about how metadata does this filtering to help us deal with all of this information. He says, there's no such thing as information overload. There's only filter failure. The idea here being that if you're overwhelmed with information, it's because there's not enough metadata and enough smart filtering to get that information down to what you really need. And this is a similar idea. The solution to the information overload problem, he says, is to create more information. That information is specifically in the form of metadata. So, so that's the most common use, but there are a few other really important ways that metadata helps us as technical communicators. One is that it enables reuse, and there are several ways it does that. First of all, it makes it easier for us as authors to look for content before we publish, content that already exists in our repository that we might be able to reuse. So it helps us find that content and be able to repurpose it. That structural metadata, for example, DITA, if you're, the elements in the DITA architecture, if you're using DITA, it could be another architecture as well, provides a framework, a predictable framework, and that framework is really important to allowing you to reuse components. It allows you to plug and play, basically, kind of like Legos, and you can't do that unless you have a schema set up, and that's really, really a form of metadata, defining particular elements and the way they fit together. Conditional metadata also really supports reuse because it basically allows us to reuse a piece of content even if that content needs to be slightly different in different situations. So for example, I can write a topic and 90% of it needs to be the same for that manager and that employee, but there needs to be one note that's different. With metadata, I can put that note in there and put a piece of metadata on it and say this only applies to managers. Then I can still reuse that content, which means I don't have to author 2 topics, I don't have to maintain 2 topics, and I don't have to translate 2 topics. So metadata really helps with reuse. It can also help with content development workflows and content management. And this is a lot of the administrative metadata works on this part. So it allows you to track content through editorial workflows, so you can tell that something is in a draft stage, or you can tell that it's out to SME review and then it needs to go to legal review, for example. You can have metadata that tracks all of that, and then in combination with, say, a content management tool or workflow management tool, gives you better visibility and control of your entire content development process. So those are just a couple ways. I have one more here. Metadata can also help you learn about your clients, and by learning about your clients, then improve your client experience. And this, sometimes people will ask, well, you talked about user-generated content that doesn't follow a schema, where people just make things up, and how useful is that? And one of the ways that it can be really useful is if you study it, because if you have somebody who's dedicated to looking at that information, say that's coming in on a social site, you have a community site you can begin to see what language your clients are using, and that can help you communicate better with them. You can set up synonyms so that even if they're using different terms, they're going to find information that's relevant, even if you're using a different term. You can see areas where they're having problems, so you can learn a lot by studying the metadata. For example, most major corporations are going to have somebody somewhere who is jumping right on any tweet that has the hashtag fail and your company name in it, right? So, so you can use it in ways that we might not have thought of. So, just real quickly, I think this is my last slide. Right after this one is, how does this affect me, right? How is this really going to affect what I do on a daily basis? And just, as a quick summary, there's going to be some new roles as we do more and more metadata and metadata management. And there's also going to be some new tasks for old roles. So some of the new roles, if you don't already have these in your organizations, might be information architects or metadata and taxonomy specialists who will work on defining those schemas, right? They'll figure out what requirements you have, what you need to do with metadata, and then they'll figure out the best categories and values for that metadata, and then they'll set up policies for using and applying that metadata. Then content creators, so these are existing writers, will now need to spend, have some new skills and spend a little more time tagging content, right? the content creators are still, I think, in most organizations, going to be responsible for kind of that first line of applying metadata. So you have to understand metadata enough to and understand the particular policies and particular schemas that your organization has set up to tag your content as you create it. And that's really important because metadata, any metadata-driven process like search or dynamic publishing is only as good as the metadata that is applied to the content. So this is really key. I mean, metadata becomes everybody's responsibility, really. You might also have some advanced content engineers or search specialists or publishing specialists who work on building systems that use that metadata to do things like dynamic publishing and those really smart searches. So there's a little engineering that goes on there in order to figure out how to use that metadata to do what you want to do with it. And then the last is you might have people doing that kind of research I was talking about. These might be social media curators or dedicated UX researchers or even people in your client support organization who might be seeing these user-generated tags and doing some analysis on that. That can help you define your official taxonomies as well as give you, all kinds of feedback in terms of usability failures, for example, or new features people want, or just even the language that clients are using and how you might want to change the ethos of your project. So there's a lot of potential uses for metadata in our field. So I've gone a little over, but I am happy to take questions. I do just want to let you know about a few resources here. I have 2 slides worth of people who have influenced me and good resources if you want to know more about metadata, including a link to the program that I got my practitioner certification from. And at the very end is my bio, which will be in the slides, which I will post on SlideShare, and Liz will also upload with the YouTube video, I believe. So
absolutely.
I'll hand it over to Liz, who has an announcement, and I'm happy to take your questions.
This is your time to type in your questions. Tony, that was fantastic. A great summary of the types and dimensions all the metadata draws on. I've got a few questions, but first, let's tell everybody what's coming up next month and at the end of this one. All right, so our next TC Dojo Mastermind session is July 19th. This is a member monthly driven discussion group where attendees present their specific challenges to each other in a confidential, supportive environment. Mastermind groups have been cited in Forbes as being extremely valuable to their attendees, and we have 2 going on right now. One is Everything TechCom, data to topic-based authoring to specifics of cross-references or graphics. The other is Product Focus on ArborText and Windchill. It's a collaborative peer-to-peer environment where everyone lends their experience to one another. You can sign up at the TC Dojo website. And next month in the session, we're going to start doing some professional skill development. This is Be a Part and Be Out. If you've ever wanted to go out on your own or move up in your organization, have been not the one that's sought out for that, there are skills you need to make that transition. And Janice Summers from JLS Coaching is going to come and talk about that kind of stuff. And we're launching a new thing shortly thereafter. It's going to be really fun. And interesting to see. If you are on the East Coast, TC Summer Camp happens at the end of this month, coming up really soon. It's on a Saturday. If you are within driving distance of Fairfax, Virginia, we'll be out at George Mason having an unconference. And if you've never been to one, they are amazing, dramatic, intense, and just all kinds of crazy. And a great, great time. We've been asked to take this on the road, and now that we are a nonprofit, we're coming to you. To sign up for the next Dojo session, you can get it right here on the website. You just scroll down to the bottom. You'll see what's coming up. I think all the way through the end of December, we've got everything planned. So be sure and check in right there. We have questions. All right, here's the first one. What sort of academic or training programs would be most useful for someone wanting to become a taxonomy ontology expert? It seems big data and IoT have created a new industry focused on data science, for example. That's not new. Tony.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I don't have completely current information on that. I know that a lot of people I work with who are taxonomy specialists have backgrounds in library science or information science. there are quite a few really good information schools now. UW has one. There's one at Berkeley. They're scattered all over the country, and I suspect those would be good places to start. Liz, do you have any other insights on that?
So it's great you mentioned the iSchools. They've really been coming up and around, and that UW one is fascinating. Library science is the key for creating that kind of stuff. Data science is kind of different. It is the same and yet different. Data science is usually the software computer architecture people, and they're a little bit different. And that's been going on at least 15 years now, just judging by the SIG we have here in the San Francisco Bay for the ACM. And that was going to be my follow-up question for you, because I would like a link to that Denver Post article. Netflix has spoken openly about using metadata to figure out programming. Like House of Cards actually came out of a statistical analysis of what people want to see, who they want to see in it, and Kevin Spacey and House of Cards are one of those things. So I don't want to get, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, and if it's done well, right? If you have resources to dedicate to it, and you really invest in it, using user-generated metadata, and not even user-generated metadata. I mean, a lot of it is just based on browsing histories and viewing histories and all of that, right? You can really use metadata as kind of free card sorting, as on a massive scale.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll definitely send it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was done. I said I'll send you the link, though.
Please do. I know that if, so we're going to post this video on YouTube. I'll probably post a link also to the Netflix presentation they did for the San Francisco Bay, if anybody's just curious about that kind of stuff. I know that they just did a presentation a month ago out here at the Microsoft campus, but I didn't get to go. They were booked solid. Even being a council member doesn't help you get into some sessions, but that video will be posted shortly. All right, here we've got another good question. Are you ready? As it relates to visual data, i.e. SVGA files, what challenges and opportunities do you see organizations facing managing those assets, i.e. connecting technical illustrations to unstructured data from a metadata perspective?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I am not an expert on that. And I've had to deal with it actually more from a video point of view than straight visual. But it's a really good question, and I really am not that experienced in it. I do know from a video point of view, right? That was one of the big complaints about video, right? Is that you can kind of attach metadata to the as it were the outside of a video, but being able to do things like chapters or markers inside of video and captioning in kind of smaller chunks used to be hard. But now there are a lot of really great video management, digital management, asset management tools that do allow that. I am more versed in the text-based stuff right now. So if anybody else has experience on that, they want to jump in the conversation, now is the time.
Absolutely. I think they're going to make, just given the problem space and what's happening already, I think that's where a lot of interesting stuff is going to come shortly, I think.
And that sounds like an excellent topic for a follow-up Dojo session in 2017.
No kidding. All right, I need to find some folks for that. All right, so I have one more question. Metadata and taxonomy, do you look to standards for some of that, like for warnings and hazard types, other kinds of things like that?
Oh, I'm really glad that the question of standards came up. There are, because that's a really important question. And there's kind of a continuum of where people sit with, in relation to standards. There were idealists at the beginning of it, well, not the beginning, but, idealists who have wanted to try to come up, one approach to doing taxonomy is to try to come up with the master taxonomy that considers everything and is perfect, and it's nearly impossible to do. And the other is to kind of work in pieces and do what's called linked data, which is a whole nother presentation. And there are standards for doing linked data as well, and that kind of allows you to do kind of workable metadata without having to perfect it, and then you can link to protocols that have been standardized. But I do want to also mention standards in general, because there are some standards. You should use existing standards whenever you can, right? Because it makes it easier. Well, first of all, it's a whole lot of work you don't have to do. Second of all, it makes it easier to align and be interoperable with other content or other systems, right? So the more you can do that, the better. And there are, right, there are things like Dublin Core, which is a standard for certain types of publishing. And there are also industry-specific taxonomies. And again, it's in your best interest to use those whenever you can. At a conference I went to recently, the CEO of WAND was there, and they're the largest producer of kind of custom industry-based taxonomies. So there are a lot of them out there. Some of them are in the public domain, some of them aren't. But certainly, if you're working in a particular industry, you should do some research to see if there are taxonomies and standards that already exist that you can then build on or use as a or link to, or whatever works for your situation. But that is really an important thing, particularly when you're first starting, right?
Yeah.
Not sure if I answered the question completely.
No, that's good. It made me think of, of library science again. Well, but everything, whenever I'm thinking metadata, I always do. There we go. All right, folks. Tony, awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. This is fantastic.
Thanks for me.
Anybody needs to get in touch with her, she's right there on Twitter. And be sure to sign up to the mailing list so you get notified when the video is posted. And just in case you want to vote on what topics are coming up, be sure and do that. You guys choose the topics. We go find people like Tony to teach and at least make you dangerous, if nothing else. All right, thanks everybody, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Liz. Bye-bye.